22 is obviously looking at American involvement in the Second World War. As always, we're not all that concerned with battles and troop movements so much as we are the kinds of changes that are happening socially and politically, mostly back home. So question number one, what steps led to American participation in World War II? A couple of things of importance here. One is that as fascism became a rising force throughout the world, the United States tried to halt its advance in a variety of ways. One was through FDR's pursuit of so-called good neighbor policy in Latin America. His intent here is to develop a kind of common front against fascism in the Western Hemisphere. He had the United States renounce armed interventions in Latin American political affairs and work to develop reciprocal trade relationships rather than exploitative ones as we had done in the past. Now, again, fascism is expanding aggressively in both Europe and Asia. Germany had remilitarized and reclaimed former territory that had been lost to them in the Versailles Treaty as the Japanese expanded across the Pacific and into mainland Asia, invading China. Now, isolationism had been the chief foreign policy in the 1920s, and that carries over into the 1930s. There was the perception that US involvement in the First World War had been a mistake, and many Americans had ethnic and cultural ties to both sides in the war. Congress will pass the Neutrality Acts that ban travel on belligerent ships and selling arms to countries at war. Furthermore, the so-called Stimson Doctrine, adopted by the United States, declared that the US would not recognize any territory that had been taken by force. This was primarily aimed at Japan, but it means that we stopped short of taking military action as the Imperial Japanese expanded aggressively in the Pacific. World War II itself will begin in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. Germany will go on to defeat other powers, including France in 1940. They will attempt to invade Britain, but the British will hold out against invasion. But throughout that time, the United States moves towards supporting the Allies, in particular the British. This will come by way of a couple of things. One is the so-called cash and carry policy. This was kind of a way around the Neutrality Acts, and it allowed the United States to sell arms to foreign powers so long as they paid cash for it and transported it themselves on their own ships, hence cash and carry. This was intended to help sell arms to Britain to fend off the Nazis during the Battle of Britain. Another way we try to get around the Neutrality Acts is through the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. This allowed for the sale of arms if their value was returned after the war. Essentially, we are lending or leasing these arms if the value is repaid either in cash or more commonly, as it will turn out, with military bases throughout the world. And this is intended to help both Britain and the Soviet Union. And FDR used this to characterize the United States as being an arsenal of democracy. A more concrete step toward entering the war on the side of the Allies came with the Atlantic Charter in 1941. Here, FDR met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and they issued a broad statement of US and British war aims, even before the United States had entered. And importantly, the war aims included the reestablishment of self-government for conquered nations. Hence, this would not be a war, if we get involved, a war for conquest, but rather a war for liberation. Of course, what ultimately brings the United States into World War II is when the Japanese attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in December of 1941. This happens because in 1940, the United States had cut Japan off from vital supplies, including oil, steel, gasoline, scrap metal, etc., in the hopes that that would help to halt their expansion in the Pacific. Japan, however, essentially interpreted this as an act of war and determined to hobble the American fleet before it can be used against them. The attack leads the United States to declare war on the Axis powers, which includes Japan, but also Germany and Italy. We will determine to go after Germany first, believing that they were the more formidable foe, which turns out not to be true, but also because if we could help the British and the Soviets defeat the Germans, then they would be freed up to help us defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. And I know we don't normally get into battles and things, but I think it's important to understand the course of this war because it will very much influence the aftermath of a kind of international U.S. presence. So the United States focused its attention, or most of its attention, on Europe first. This is the so-called Germany first strategy. Again, there was the perception that the Germans were the more formidable enemy. This turns out not to be true, but it is probably the effect of or consequence of racial attitudes at the time. Also, again, a victory in Europe would help to free up the Allies to help the United States defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. The U.S. sees their first fighting in the war alongside Britain in North Africa, where we will work to reclaim oil fields taken by the Germans and then move on to invade Italy. This Italian invasion will importantly open up a second front against the Axis powers in Europe, which relieves some of the pressure on the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Next, the United States and Britain will land in France on D-Day and liberate that country and then begin to push toward Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviets also pushed toward Germany from the east in an enormous counteroffensive. And not to minimize the British and American contributions to defeating the Nazis in this war, but frankly, the Soviets did much more of the fighting and dying and killing than the British and the Americans combined. Throughout this entire period, of course, the Holocaust is being perpetrated mostly in Eastern Europe by the Nazis, and Americans will be among those who liberate some of these camps, and this will be influential on American policy back home later on. But many of the camps are actually liberated by the Soviets just because they're in Eastern Europe, which is where the Soviets are. Now, meanwhile, the United States did continue to fight in the Pacific, but most of our attention was on Europe. The United States developed the strategy of island hopping in the Pacific toward Japan. The idea was that the United States could skip over some Japanese occupied islands, thus isolating them and cutting them off. And that would allow us also to move quicker to establish airfields and other bases that could be used as we kind of hopped our way toward the Japanese mainland. Number two, how did the United States mobilize economic resources and promote popular support for the war effort? So just as in the Civil War and World War I, the size of the federal government will expand substantially in order to conduct this war. One example is that the government creates the War Production Board, which is tasked with regulating industry in order to produce much needed war materials. In that sense, it's very much like the War Industries Board from back in World War I. And keep in mind, World War II is very much a war that is about outproducing the enemy. And the United States is a major industrial power, and that is what is going to allow us ultimately to become victorious. And by the way, it is this demand for wartime labor that will finally end the Great Depression and the high unemployment rates therein. The New Deal had definitely alleviated some of the symptoms of the Great Depression, but what firmly ends our economic plight there is going to be our involvement in World War II, because we have to put everyone to work manufacturing stuff for the war. Another government agency that is illustrative of this expansion of government in wartime is the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, which controlled prices and established a rationing system with the hopes of controlling inflation or rapidly rising prices during the war. Next, the Office of War Information was charged with selling the war as a war to preserve freedom. It was similar to the Committee on Public Information during World War I, except that they were very conscious in trying to prevent the kind of radical fanatic nationalism that broke out during the First World War. Congress also passes a new Selective Service Act, or a new draft that will ultimately draft 1.4 million men on top of all of those who actually volunteered for military service. Women, of course, will serve in crucial roles in the war effort. Just as they had in World War I, women will fill workplace roles that had been vacated by men who had gone overseas to fight. And notably, in this war, women will not only make up 1/3 of the labor force, but an additional 350,000 women will serve for the first time in military units, or what are called military auxiliary or support units. So they're not going to be in combat roles, but they will finally be allowed to join the military in some capacity. One example would be the Women's Army Corps. Rosie the Riveter becomes a national symbol of women's contribution to the war effort. And it will also become a kind of cultural, or she will also become a kind of cultural icon for the women's liberation movement beginning in the 1960s later on. But a lot of these women who gain significantly more independence and certainly jobs and education during the war as opportunities opened up, many of them hope to maintain that independence and keep those jobs after the war. They will not, in large part, they will not be able to, and that will be yet another source of the women's liberation movement that kind of simmers in the 50s and then finally breaks out in the 1960s, as we'll see later. Number three, what visions of America's post-war role began to emerge during the war? So there were widespread hopes for prosperity and even an affluent society after the war was over with. So, for example, Henry Luce published in 1941 something called The American Century, which argued that America was poised to become the dominant world power and that it would share the benefits of its industrial products and democratic values when it does. Liberals back home called for an expansion of the New Deal's welfare state, even in peacetime. They wanted government programs to ensure full employment, an expansion of Social Security, etc. And they sought to continue the Keynesianism of the New Deal. They wanted government to stimulate economic growth, even at the expense of big deficits. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually issues something called an Economic Bill of Rights. This is a series of proposed amendments to the Constitution. So this is not an official document that actually has any kind of authority, but he was hoping to convince Congress and people to add all of these as amendments to the Constitution. So they included things like every American would have the right to a job, an adequate wage, a decent home. Every American would have the right to medical care and good education. This is pretty remarkable. And had this been passed, America would be fundamentally different today because these rights that this Economic Bill of Rights would have assumed you had would have been on par and every bit as real as your freedom of speech or freedom of religion, because they would go into the Constitution as entitlements for people. And FDR justifies this by saying, for example, that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. Now, while FDR's Economic Bill of Rights never gets passed, so it never gets added to the Constitution, there is a significant expansion of the welfare state through what's called the GI Bill. Its official name was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but it's still commonly known today as the GI Bill. The GI Bill provided money for education and low-cost mortgage loans for veterans returning from World War II. And it's going to be a kind of repayment for their service during the war by giving them access to education and home ownership that they otherwise would not have had access to at that time. Number four, how did American minorities face threats to their freedom at home and abroad during World War II? So the Nazis' racist policies were portrayed as being in direct opposition to Americanism. And Americanism came to be defined in this period by pluralism or diversity of race and ethnicity. And that's going to lead to the assimilation of the new immigrants and Jews into the definition of being white in American society. And historians argue oftentimes that a lot of that had to do with the fact that all of these people were fighting side by side during the war, and that helped to kind of forge an assimilation. Note that African Americans did not benefit from this because even during World War II, African Americans are fighting in segregated units and thus will not be assimilated into mainstream American society. Next, something called the Bracero program or the Bracero Guest Workers Program encouraged Mexican immigration for wartime production. So this was intended to be a temporary measure to allow for immigrants in to work in agriculture for the duration of the war. Um, but it ends up actually reinforcing stereotypes of Mexican Americans as unskilled laborers fit only for agricultural work. That said, it does open up opportunities for second generation Mexican Americans, um, but they are still faced with discrimination and racism. Clear example of this are the so-called Zoot Suit riots of 1943, where sailors and policemen in Los Angeles attacked young Hispanic and Mexican American men, or so-called Zoot Suiters, because they typically conform to a style of wearing so-called zoot suits, just kind of like oversized suits, long chains, really big hats with a big flourish of a feather, that kind of thing. So the riots were caused by the perception that these young men were not doing their part in the war. They weren't working in wartime facilities or sorry, factories. They weren't, joining up in the military. And while this certainly was not true, it did lead to open violence in the streets, the attacks on Mexican American barrios in Los Angeles. And it was a pretty ugly event during the war, kind of resemblant to the race riots in World War One. Despite this perception that Zoot Suiters were proof that Mexican Americans were not doing their part in the war, this just isn't true. About 500,000 Mexican Americans served in every branch of the American military during this war and pulled their weight the same as any other group did. Speaking of which, Native Americans also served in the military and in wartime industries during the war. In particular, the Navajo tribe provided so-called code talkers. The Navajo used their native language for code in the Pacific Theater. Navajo was an unwritten language that's very consonant heavy, and rather than using a mathematical code to transmit plans, we actually used a real language that, only a couple hundred people actually spoke. So the code talkers saved countless lives in the Pacific. Many other Native Americans from a variety of different tribes worked in wartime industries, but that has an effect on their reservations as many of them don't return to the reservations after the war is over with, instead deciding to stay away from the reservations and take economic opportunities as they were offered. And World War One sees one of the worst civil rights abuses in American history. Japanese Americans are interned in camps, or really concentration camps, during the war. And that's over 100,000 people, most of which were American citizens. And this was based on racist ideas at the time that considered Japanese Americans to be security threats because they had on the assumption that they had dual loyalties to Japan, and there were stereotypes about the Japanese being saboteurs and spies and other things like that. So this was based in racism, and we can even see that when we, look at other groups that are interned during the war, because if this was purely a wartime measure, then German Americans and Italian Americans would have been interned as well. And while that did happen, we did have some German Americans and Italian Americans put in camps. Um, each the number of each of those was less than 1% of their population. So less than 1% of the German American population ends up in camps, and the same can be said for Italian Americans. Whereas Japanese internment put 87% of all Japanese Americans in camps out west. Um, this was done via Executive Order 9066 issued by FDR. Um, and again, this is based in racist ideas that considered the Japanese Americans to be a potential security threat due to prevailing racial attitudes at the time. We can even see that in the way that the Japanese are dehumanized in propaganda and in pop culture of the time. Now, this internment of Japanese Americans into concentration camps based purely on their ethnicity was amazingly upheld in the Supreme Court in 1944 in a case called Korematsu v. US. It was declared to be a wartime necessity and thus constitutional. So here again, we have another example of how civil rights and civil liberties tend to be restricted during time of war in American history. Worth noting, I think, is that thousands of Japanese Americans served in the military even while their families were in camps. And in fact, during the war, the 442nd Regiment was composed almost entirely of second generation Japanese Americans and became the most decorated unit in military history. And that still holds true today. Oh, there they are. Sorry, forgot to click. There's the 442nd Regiment. They served mostly in the European theater parts of Germany, Italy, and France. During the war, for African Americans, we see another kind of great migration take place as over 1 million African Americans moved from the South to the North and Midwest for wartime industrial jobs. Again, they will face discrimination and they will face race riots as they had during the First World War as African American populations in these cities swell to the point that white residents take out their anger about that through riots. Over 1 million African Americans served in the military. Again, they will serve in segregated units. However, this will be the last war in which that is the case. President Harry Truman, who's going to become president after FDR dies in office, he's going to issue an executive order after World War II in 1948 that will desegregate the military. However, though, many African Americans found the benefits of the GI Bill to be pretty limited because they were still frequently denied admissions to colleges, they were still frequently denied loans. Keep in mind that this money coming from the federal government is being directed and handed out by local officials, which means that in whites who are handling this in the South or elsewhere are still not issuing loans. They are still for mortgages, and they are still not admitting African Americans to colleges. During the war, though, African Americans also faced discrimination in working in wartime industries. And a civil rights reformer at the time, a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who was a member of the NAACP, called for a march on Washington in 1941 in order to protest hiring discrimination in wartime industries and put pressure on FDR and Congress to do something about it. And while the march actually won't take place because FDR will step in to do something about it before that happens. The threat of a march on Washington in wartime was enough to get FDR to act. So FDR will issue an executive order. It's 8802 to ban discrimination in defense jobs. Civil rights organization or African American civil rights organizations during the war also grew substantially. They were pursuing something they called the Double V campaign, which implied victory over tyranny overseas as well as victory here at home. If we're fighting for democracy across the world, then we should be fighting for democracy here at home as well for people who are being denied their basic civil rights and civil liberties due to prevailing racial prejudices of the time. It's this double V campaign that's going to give birth to the civil rights movement. And even though we tend to associate the civil rights movement with the 1960s, its roots go back to the 40s, and many of the main events of the civil rights movement that most people are familiar with actually happened during the 1950s. During the war, civil rights organizations like the NAACP and CORE, which is the Congress on Racial Equality, see their memberships grow substantially during and then immediately after the war as African Americans come home and find the benefits of their fight for democracy and the GI Bill pretty limited. Number five, how did the end of the war begin to shape the post-war world? This is very important because whereas after World War I, the United States reverted to a more traditional stance by becoming isolationist, that's not going to happen after World War II. If World War I allowed for the United States to emerge as a global power, it's World War II that establishes the United States as a global superpower. Um, Germany will surrender in 1944, but the Japanese will continue to fight for months thereafter. The Japanese proved to be much more formidable enemies than the Germans ever had been. And this is going to lead President Truman, again, Harry S. Truman becomes president after FDR dies in office. President Truman will authorize the use of the atomic bomb on Japan in order to force their surrender. This is a new weapon that had been developed by the United States through the Manhattan Project, which had been authorized by FDR years before. And again, its use was meant to prevent a costly invasion of Japan, which was assumed by estimates at the time to cost at least 1 million American lives and many more times that in terms of Japanese lives. Uh, the first atomic bomb that's dropped will be dropped on Hiroshima in Japan and kill about 70,000 people instantaneously. And then a couple of days later, we will drop a second on the city of Nagasaki, also killing about 70,000 people instantaneously. Thousands more Japanese in these two cities will die from radiation poisoning in the following years. The death toll for this is very high, and it will force Japan to surrender. They will surrender in August 1945, which is only 1 week after dropping the second atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Now, I'll note at this point, we are the only nation on Earth that has this technology. This is the most powerful weapon ever invented by humanity. It can take out an entire city with a single bomb, and we are the only ones that have the capability to create these. In 1943, so a few years before the war ended, you have the big three begin to meet. The big three are the leaders of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. So together we are the allies that are fighting against the Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and to a much lesser extent, Italy. The big three meet at Iran in 1943, at Yalta in 1945, and then again at Potsdam in 1945. But frankly, the only one you really need to know, because it's the most important, is the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference is the important one to know because it's here that the Soviet Union agrees to help the United States in the war against Japan once the Germans are defeated. More importantly, though, the Soviet Union promises to allow for free elections in Eastern Europe once the war is over with. The Soviets, in their push toward Germany, had reclaimed countries in Eastern Europe that had been taken and controlled by the Germans. They were occupying them now, and there were fears that the Soviet Union would simply add them to their territory, effectively conquering them. The Soviets at Yalta promised that they will allow for free elections. Long story short, they don't. All of these countries will amazingly elect communist leaders that will tie themselves directly to the Soviet Union and do whatever they say. this will be something to talk about, obviously, in the next chapter for the Cold War. But for the time being, understanding that the Soviets promise free elections but ultimately do not allow them is an important takeaway. Also, you see there on the right-hand side of the screen, Germany gets divided up into 4 zones, one for each one of the allies. So you've got a British zone, an American zone, a Soviet zone, and then a French zone. Each one of these countries is responsible for putting or repairing this zone in the wake of the war. The idea is that we had left Germany in such bad shape after the end of World War I that it had actually helped lead to the rise of the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler and thus the Second World War. So the plan here is to reconstruct Germany in a way that they will not threaten world peace again. Now, the Americans, the British, and the French are hoping to reconstruct Germany as a democratic capitalist state, whereas the Soviets are looking to prevent another world war by weakening Germany. And they want to create a communist state that is effectively yet another satellite of the Soviet Union, just as those Eastern European nations will become. So Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones for reconstruction, and this will be let's say, a source of contention later on. Even the capital will be divided into 4 zones. Note that the capital of Berlin is actually well within the Soviet zone, so it itself gets divided up into 4 little zones too. This, again, is going to cause some problems later. Next, the United Nations will be established in 1945, just prior to the end of the war. It was intended to be like the League of Nations, but theoretically more effective. So it would be more inclusive and more powerful. The General Assembly of the United Nations would give every nation a voice in global affairs, and this would serve as a diplomatic body to allow for nations to solve their differences and work collectively rather than resorting to war as a means of foreign policy. But the heart of the UN is what's called the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is responsible for maintaining world peace, and they're the ones that make decisions about sending in UN peacekeepers or issuing economic sanctions or otherwise trying, again, to maintain global peace. There are a lot of rotating members, so some nations become members for a brief period of time, but there are always 5 permanent members. And those 5 permanent members are the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. Each one of these permanent members have the power to veto any decision of the UN Security Council, meaning that these 5 nations, these 5 permanent members, have to be unanimous on any decision for the UN to really get anything done. Now, the effectiveness of this will obviously be limited by disagreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, who our alliance with them is going to very quickly break down after the Second World War, and we will become adversaries very quickly. And again, we will consistently disagree with one another and veto one another on the Security Council, which makes the UN far less effective over the next few decades than it otherwise could have been and was probably intended to be. So after the war is over with, the United States, along with the Soviet Union, emerge as the dominant world superpowers. The older powers like Britain, France, Germany, Japan, they're all in ruins. It's only the United States and the Soviet Union that are still left standing with any real power over global affairs. Conflict will ensue between these 2 superpowers very quickly, and this will lead us into a period of time known as the Cold War that is characterized by high tensions, the threat of nuclear war, but never any direct conflict between the 2 powers. And that'll be the focus of the next chapter in particular, but keep in mind that the Cold War is really going to last until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. So we're establishing a confrontation in the 1940s that will last for about the next 50 years between 2 global superpowers. And as of right now, only the United States has the atomic bomb, but very soon the Soviets will develop one of their own. And that makes this confrontation all the more dangerous.